Dark, forbidding, and unfamiliar, the jungles, grasslands, and paddy fields of Vietnam became a battlefield in America's war in Southeast Asia. The Grunts, or American infantrymen, dealt with the hardships of this terrain more directly than any other American force in Vietnam.
The jungle was just extremely dense. When it was dark, visibility was just virtually zero.
You got to know where you are. And a lot of times, I was a good navigator. I could navigate okay, but there were times when we'd have to fire an artillery smoke round to verify our location.
If you're just walking through essentially what's probably double canopy jungle, it's pretty dark, and for much of it, you had to cut your way through. A guy could only stay on point, cutting with a machete, chopping enough of a trail for everybody to get through single file. You could only do it for 15 or 20 minutes.
The infantrymen lived in the field for extended periods of time, where they found the enemy was not the only killer awaiting them in the lush green vegetation.
A lot of jungle life, a lot of animals, noises that were very, very uncomfortable to you. The Central Highlands had tigers. That was also very demoralizing. When you lose somebody to something like that.
One of the most poisonous snakes in the world is a bamboo viper. And it's a big, long green snake that can be up to 6 feet long. And the guy said that if you got bit by this bamboo viper, that you should lay down right away, because that way you don't fall down when you die.
As well as difficult terrain and dangerous wildlife, the Grunts often had to deal with inclement weather.
When it rained, it got really slippery, slide and fall.
There was a lot of water in Vietnam, a lot of streams and stuff like that, and we were fording them all the time. And you'd get up to as much as chest high, but as soon as you got through the water, you virtually had to take your clothes off and rip the leeches off.
We would have 2 seasons, a wet season and a dry season. And during the wet season,
You're just wet all the time. It was pretty much constant rain. And Vietnam was affected by 2 different monsoons. One that came out of India, and then you had another season that was affected by the Pacific.
The foot soldiers were central to the American war effort in Vietnam. The struggle for the ground became the Grunts' war. The ground unit was the basic maneuver unit in Vietnam. In the days and weeks spent in the field, the ground unit was the Grunts' world.
One of my regrets is that I didn't record a lot of their real names. I kept a diary, but everybody had nicknames, and that's what I wrote, and I regret that, that I didn't write more of their real names. Guitar Man, Preacher, Alabama's from Alabama, obviously. Cherry, who became a very good friend of mine. Shotgun, Coco, Bambi, Yoshi. Just a myriad of great names, but I unfortunately did not record the real names with it. I wish I would have done that.
Helicopters offered the infantry far-ranging movement and almost continuous supply. However, helicopters weren't always available to ground forces, so at times, the Grunt literally carried the American war effort on his back.
Said you need to carry 500 rounds of ammunition, you're going to carry the gun, you're going to carry 2 claymores, you're going to carry 4 pounds of C4, you're going to have 4 grenades, and you're also going to carry your food. Or you don't have to carry your food. We don't care. You don't have to carry any water if you don't want to. That's fine too. But most people carry a gallon of water or so because we don't get resupplied that much with fresh water. So it ended up, by the time we put all that stuff on, I had to have at least 120 or 30 pounds on my back, along with that gun.
From the line company, what I remember is being really tired all the time. So tired I didn't think I could take another step. I mean, every step I took felt like that. And then at night, trying to sleep, you know, you divide up guard duty between however many people you have in the squad. If you're fat and you got like 6 guys or 7, then you get to sleep for 6 hours at a time or 5 hours at a time. But if there's only 4 of you, you know, then you're up twice during the night sometimes, pulling guard for an hour or so. And if you're kind of depending on where you are and what you're doing, but if you're out in the field and you're in 2-man holes, you know, then you're basically up every other hour all night. So I mostly remember feeling like everything I did, whether it was walking or digging a hole or anything else, was just about the last reserve of energy I had. It's a hard life.
I was tired to the point where all I was thinking about was my responsibility to my squad and killing the enemy. And I was angry all the time. And yet I didn't, it wasn't the kind of anger where I suddenly got angry. I was just grouchy all the time. I didn't even know it. I didn't even know how it was coming across. But it was just a very bitter feeling, like I couldn't wait to get in the next firefight to get some revenge.
I think anger makes you function. Instead of showing fear, you show anger, and you tend to fight back.
The day-to-day routine while I was with both infantry companies was really very, very similar.
Get up in the morning, what you do is you get out some sea rations, or whatever you wanted to eat, and mainly that's what it was sea rations. And you eat something, you hang around for a while, wait for whatever we waited for. You know, we'd get orders, and then we'd get up, maybe move over here, move over there. Sometimes we'd go 10 feet, sometimes we'd go a couple miles.
A lot of it was boredom. Just a lot of patrolling, carrying your rucksack, maybe the radio, maybe the gun, the machine gun. A lot of hard work, sweat, and occasionally something would happen. And that would be the shock. After the boredom for a certain amount of time, you could get lulled into a false sense of security.
Any type of mission that you went on that was going to, of course, all of them always had the opportunity to turn into two combat missions, whether they be us as the aggressor and initiating the ambush, or whether we were victims of the ambush.
A lot of times our people would be surprised, and usually you set up in an L-shaped ambush, and there was a lot of times that one 2VC jump out of the woods and just empty their weapons up and down a line like so, and wipe out 3 or 4 people and wound the rest, and it happened all the time. You're really weak at that time when you're just setting up and not ready, and that's when they'd hit.
Once you're engaged, if you know what you're doing and you've got a little bit of experience behind you, you don't stop and think about it. It's pretty much you're on a automatic mode, or you should be anyway. You know what you're doing, what you should be doing, and you just kind of operate that way. If you just have to stop and think, it's like self-defense. You have to stop and think what to do. It's probably too late, so you have to react and respond according to your training. Now, I'd read in stories and something about the taste of fear. It's true. It's a copper taste.
We had a new lieutenant that's fresh in country, and we had dug in. We were set up for the night. We were going to stay there for a couple of days, and we got probed. He calls a fire mission in, gave him bad coordinates. I'm I mean, stuff is going off over my head. I mean, this chunks of metal are hitting into the bunker that we dug and fill these sandbags. People would go nuts in the middle of the night, fire off a bunch of rounds, trigger off claymores, throw grenades. Nothing be out there. You know, it's just fear.
We got set up, and the squad leader said that, you know, if anything did happen, nobody shoots until he blows the claymores. I was pretty scared, but I didn't really expect anything. And about midnight, 1 o'clock, well, I looked up and it looked like 2 or 3 flashlights out in front of us about, I don't know, 45, 50 feet. Then all of a sudden, this explosion went off that was so loud, I couldn't hear anything. And then there was leaves and dust and dirt flying everywhere. And I heard the M60 open up. And then I heard the rifles open up. And so I fired off a magazine. And then one of the guys next to me, I don't know, I fired 1 magazine and managed to get reloaded. And I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything.
When you are actually in contact, what we refer to as in contact, it is utter chaos. It is absolutely total chaos. The sound is just overwhelming. You're getting the sound from not only your own weapon systems, but also the enemy's weapon systems. You really have to work very, very closely as a team. You have to know each other very, very well. You need to know what that person's capabilities are and what they're going to do on both sides of you. You don't have time to think. You have to react. You do it. You get the job done. And I'm not saying that you aren't scared in the process, but you have to train yourself to think that there is time to be scared later.
The infantry was not alone when fighting in Vietnam. Wherever they went, they were able to call upon almost instantaneous support. There was a variety of support available to infantry in Vietnam. Artillery and mortars provided the bulk of the firepower that the U.S. Army depended on. Some units carried their own fire support in the form of 81mm mortars.
I think one of the reasons that maybe I'm here doing this interview, and a lot of my men made it through, is the fact that we had a mortar and used it.
We went through a period where we went on a couple of different patrols where we humped 81mm, carried them out in the field. And you're talking about, you know, a barrel that weighs about 65 pounds and a base plate that weighs, a 2-piece base plate that weighs 30 pounds, and a bipod that weighs about 60 pounds. And the sight and the aiming stakes don't weigh that much, but they're clumsy. There's 4 of them, and they're each 2-piece, and you have a little bag that you carry them in. And aiming stake's about 7 feet tall, so they're about 4 feet. Each piece is about 3.5, 4 feet long. So you're packing them. The squad leader packs the aiming stakes and the sight in a case. And then the crews packing, your ammo bearers and stuff are packing the various parts of the gun. And you got everybody in the company packing 3 mortar rounds, and they all hate you. But mortars are about the only weapon you can use to support troops in jungle because they are indirect fire. They come almost straight down. So if your canopy's open at all, they'll make it to the ground.
Mortars weren't only called upon to fight the enemy. Special ammunition could be used to combat the darkness that often faced the Grunts.
If somebody called for illumination over their position, mortars are the fastest thing to get into operation. When the flare is descending, the wind always, and it's always oscillating, essentially moving back and forth as it under the parachute. And so what it's doing is it looks like everything in front of you is moving. The shadows, it has the effect of moving all the shadows out there if you're looking at brush and trees and rocks and things like that, it looks like they're all moving. But you can actually, it gives you a really bright blue-white light that you can actually see by.
In addition to the mortars, there was artillery in position to support the infantry. With a longer range and larger shells, their fire was deadly.
I remember going through the jungle one time, and it was really sort of funny. As we're going through the jungle, artilleries, 105s, are shooting right in front of us. They're actually landing shells, you know, I don't know, 300 yards or so out in front of us. And so basically where we're going through, it's been cleared out already.
Another use of mortars and artillery was harassment and interdiction.
Every night I was there, we fired H&Is, harassment and interdiction. You would look and pick out a number of different, usually routes of ingress or egress for possible enemy movements. Pick those out, mark them, you know, the grids on a map, transmit that information to the Fire Direction Center, and then the H&Is, we would be given maybe, not 8 or 9 different fire missions. We get all the information at one time, usually before dark, and then it was up to us to fire the first mission anytime during the first hour of darkness, you know, between, let's say, 7 and 8 p.m. We had to fire 5 rounds on this grid coordinate, but it was our pick, and there was no rhyme or reason to when we did it other than sometime during that hour. And then the next hour, the next grid coordinates, and so on through the night. And that I can remember we did that literally every single night.
Harassment and interdiction, or H&I fires, are used by American units to plot likely enemy positions or enemy avenues of approach to the American position, and they're fired randomly during the hours of darkness, almost nightly by all American units in Vietnam, in order to keep the enemy off balance and, you know, to limit the enemy's ability to use the night against the American position.
This complex fire control system did not always work to perfection. With so much power unleashed, sooner or later, accidents would happen.
I can remember being in the field at times, and there were units in the field we were never told that they were in the field, you know, what they were doing. They were reporting on troop movements, they're U.S. troop movements. There were instances where guys were calling artillery in on U.S. units because they didn't know they were U.S. units in that area. So friendly fire wasn't a lot about mistakes and coordinates, it was mistakes and people not knowing who was out in the field.
Also important, and certainly more spectacular, was the support provided by armed helicopters and close air support. Armed helicopters were often the first to respond. However, nothing was more impressive to the men on the ground than the close air support.
You can hear them coming. I mean, they're a really loud, ear-splitting, you know, jet noise. And we saw a lot of them pretty close, really. I mean, within, I'm guessing, a couple thousand meters. They come in, drop bombs, 200 or 500 pounders, and you hear the real sharp slashing kind of a sound. And then they drop the bombs and pull up, and the sound kind of gets softer, and then the bomb goes off, and they're unbelievably loud. I mean, movies and stuff don't do justice to the kind of noises those things make. My impression of TAC Air was that it was pretty effective. If you actually had a target, look out, because there's not going to be much left of it.
Fire support wasn't always available to the infantry. At these times, the unit in trouble had to call on other American units for help.
All of a sudden we got hit from, seems like, all sides. And we didn't have any heavy support. There was another outfit there, another American outfit close to the area. They came in with some tanks and actually saved our bacon, but several guys were wounded in the company I was in, but luckily nobody got killed.
In Vietnam, tanks and armored vehicles offered invaluable and surprisingly effective support to infantry units. When American units first arrived in Vietnam, effective use of armor seemed unlikely.
I think it was a surprise to a lot of people how well certain types of armor could operate in Vietnam. And I believe it was since shown that over half of the country was suitable for armored warfare. And I'm not saying half of it for the big M48 tanks, you know, the 52-ton behemoths, but for the lighter armed vehicles, the ACAV, the Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle, and also the light 17-ton Sheridan tanks, which is also a form of an assault vehicle. Those tracks could go just about anywhere. If a water buffalo could traverse it, an ACAV could go there. Well, there are certainly places where it was so thick that you could not literally see beyond the sides or the end of your track, and that wasn't good for us. We could maneuver through it, and I should say we could move through it, but we really couldn't maneuver. We were better in the lighter wooded areas where the trees were just a few inches in diameter, because we could fairly easily knock those down and move through there in a combat formation faster than a person could run. And then, of course, if there were any cleared areas or roads, we were fast.
One of the secrets of the armored unit's mobility in the terrain crisscrossed by streams and canals was the Armored Vehicle Launched Bridge, or AVLB.
The AVLB, it's an armored vehicle with a scissor bridge that spans 60 foot. Attached to the front of it, you can pull up into a small stream and drop it. And it'll span over to the other side, and you can run the tanks across it.
The armor was used almost exclusively to support infantry operations, and this was a potent combination. The vehicles provided daunting firepower, which discouraged enemy attacks against critical points and convoys.
They would mix us up into the convoy, and as long as we were in the convoy, Charlie left them alone.
U.S. forces found the venerable M48 tank well suited for Vietnam and chose to use it instead of the newer M60.
They offered us M60 tanks to go over there, but because of the suspension system and the gun, I chose to keep the M48A3 because it had the 90-millimeter gun.
The Sheridan tank eventually replaced the M48 in the line cavalry troop due to its speed, which allowed it to better keep up with the personnel carriers and its ability to traverse a wider range of terrain. However, the Sheridan had its own drawbacks.
The Sheridan is a lightweight, air-droppable, amphibious armored tank. It weighed about 17 tons. To put that in a perspective, the ACAV weighed between 11 and 12 tons. The Sheridan weighed about 17 tons. The M48 weighed about 52 tons. So you get an idea on the size. The Sheridan were configured primarily with aluminum armor. Now the turret, of course, was on the Sheridan was steel. A unique turret in that it was shaped like this, so that rounds, RPGs could deflect very easily when they hit it, because the armor wasn't thick. The Sheridan was a tremendous vehicle, but my whole tour, I never had all three operational at once. It had this massive, short, stubby, 152-millimeter main gun that was designed to fire the Shillelagh missile in the battlefields of Europe for World War III, or the desert, but it wasn't designed for the jungle. It was just wrought with electrical problems, shorts, and things like that. One of our biggest nightmares with the Sheridan was to get a ready light to fire. We just couldn't hit the firing pin and make it shoot. We had to flip a switch and get a green ready light before we could electrically detonate the round. It was unlike the M48, where you could pack that thing full of mud and still fire.
The armored cavalry units were ideal for the fighting in Vietnam. With the combination of the hitting power of the tank, the reliable M113 armored personnel carrier, and attached armored artillery and command units, the armored cavalry regiments proved to be a flexible and responsive force in the war. The M113 was soon fitted with armor plating and shields to protect the track commander with his .50 caliber machine gun and also the two side-mounted M60 30 caliber machine guns. This modification became known as the ACAV, for Armored Cavalry Vehicle. Infantry mounted on ACAVs could move rapidly through the brush, virtually immune to small arms fire, while laying down heavy suppressive fire.
As cavalry, our mission was much the same as the United States cavalry was in the 1800s, in the 19th century, out west. Our mission was pretty much the same. We'd cover a large territory. We could get there quickly. Our horse was our ACAV.
The Armored Cavalry Squadron is this extremely capable package formed by infantry riding in carriers with tanks and armored fire support vehicles and armored command vehicles. It gives the squadron the capability to move rapidly from point to point with a complete package and able to engage in combat operations.
However, all this fire support was only effective when in contact with the enemy. The enemy used the terrain of Vietnam effectively to hide from American forces. Finding the enemy was the job of the long-range reconnaissance patrols, or LRPs, who were covertly inserted by helicopter behind enemy lines, where stealth, concealment, and caution were their ally in a deadly game of cat and mouse.
The difference between infantry, straight-leg infantry, and recon, or LRPs, if you will, or your job was literally to go out and hunt other men down.
We would go in and see who was in there, see what they were doing, what kind of weapons they had, what was the Army, what was the strength of the unit, what the morale was. You know, you look for stuff like if they were leaving, which they never did, leave equipment behind.
Bunker systems, footprints, smells, sounds, quiet when you're out in the middle of the jungle, and things all of a sudden would get dead quiet.
What our job was to make, when we see the enemy, we make contact. And then we call back, and they'll fly the GIs out, you know, to combat the enemy.
A normal infantry line company, the LZ, would be prepped with Cobra gunships and maybe even artillery, and then they'd move in. Well, we basically went in hot. And what we would do is the day before, the team leader and maybe the assistant team leader would do an overflight of our AO, which is our area of operations. And they would pick a place where we were going to be picked up and then a place where we were going to be dropped off. And then we would be briefed on what we were going to do, if it was a trail watch, ambush mission, or a censoring device monitoring. And then we would get in the choppers. There'd be a couple of, I guess you call them fathom choppers that would go up that would, we'd do some false insertions at first. They'd go around different areas, maybe outside the AO in that area, and do false insertions first, and then we'd get the go-ahead and we'd head in. Ahead of time, we would decide if we were all going to get out on one side or if we're going to split up in 3 on one side and 3 on the other side, depending on lots of times where we were being dropped off in the situation. We'd get there, we'd be standing on the skids, and the chopper would go in, drop us off, and take off, and then we'd go out maybe 100 yards, 200 yards away from the where we were dropped off, the LZ. We ran 6-man teams. So you had a point man, a radio man, you had somebody that took up the rear, and normally your team leader would be in between there, and your assistant team leader would also be in that line somewhere. And then your other 2 guys would be on the side, would have your flanks, your right and left flank. You just have to move very slowly. You move the branches out of the way very slowly. You take 1 foot forward very slowly, the other one at the same time. You're trying to watch in front to make sure you aren't all of a sudden opening yourself up to a huge clearing where there might be NVA sitting there or something. Normally I wore flight gloves because maybe like if you're going through bamboo or even the elephant grass, your hands would really get cut up, and of course, in a tropical type atmosphere, they can get infected and things like that. So I always wore flight gloves just to help me keep my hands from getting infected. At that time, most of the Army there didn't have camouflage. The Marines, some of them did. So we were the only units that actually had it. We had camouflage fatigues, tiger fatigues, and every once in a while we'd wear black pajamas. Walking point, I think maybe twice I did that. Normally we carried what were called LERP rations, which were freeze-dried, like chicken and rice, and we had one that was, they called it chili con carne, but we called it bullet beans because the little beans never got soft. They were always like peanuts. And water, lots of water. The only thing we would take in C rations is maybe the cans of fruit. We tried to not have any cans as much as possible because they made rattling noises and that kind of thing.
Each LERP team had a point man who used his eyes, ears, and instincts to clear the way for the rest of the team.
He walked through on missions, whether it be through trails or through the jungle, and my was to keep an eye on front, watch out for booby traps, and of course enemy soldiers, the NVA, and just more or less getting things cleared out of the way for the rest of the team to come through, whether it be elephant grass or thick triple canopy, and just move as quietly as I possibly could.
Another role of the LERPs was intelligence gathering for American command.
The intelligence would say that there's heavy troop movement down a high-speed trail, and they would decide that we wanted to do an ambush on that. So we would set up, 12 across, we'd set up claymores, some of them we would daisy chain, and we'd have an M60, and everybody would have an assigned area of scope or area that they were supposed to fire into, and normally the team leader or somebody else would be the person that once they blew the claymores, we blew the ambush. After the ambush was done, we'd have maybe one person on each end would take each end of the trail for trail watch, and then we would go in and search the bodies, go through their clothes, get maps, any kind of information we could find that they would have that would help identify where troop movements were, what kind of soldiers they were, of course, weapons. We'd take the weapons back, and then we would call in a contact and then get picked up, hopefully picked up by the choppers. Trail watch would be all we were supposed to do would be the same type of intelligence as that there's intelligence that there's heavy movement going down this trail. Our job would be move up, watch the trail, basically gather intelligence. Who are they? What kind of troops are they? NVA, VC, what kind of uniforms they're wearing, what kind of weapons they had, ages, if they looked fresh or looked like they'd been beaten up troops, and what direction they were going, and that kind of thing.
As dangerous as LERP missions were, where they left off, Special Operations Forces picked up.
In Vietnam, American forces utilized both special operations groups and special forces. And a lot of times people get confused between the role and the function of each of these two different groups. Special forces are small teams of Americans that are sent out to work with indigenous or local people, and their role mainly is to train and advise these forces. While special operations groups have a direct combat mission. They either are reconnaissance or combat patrol kind of action. So on one hand you have training by the special forces, and on the other hand you have direct combat operations by the special operations people.
Special Operations Forces fought a remote and dangerous war, often without the same support that other American units took for granted.
The worst part in our situation was that was the lack of air support and the lack of artillery support. I mean, if you were in an isolated camp, once you got outside of the range of your own indirect fire weapons, you were normally on your own. You didn't have the resources that the regular Army units normally had at their availability. I mean, if somebody got wounded, you would call for a medevac, but there was no guarantee you were going to get it. It depends on your priority. To the American High Command, when one of our patrols got in trouble, there were just 2 Americans out there. The rest of them were CIDG, indigenous mercenaries. So if you had a major American unit that was in trouble and you were in trouble at the same time, it's a matter of priorities. You know, where do they send the help? The Army actually thought about reinstating the use of carrier pigeons while I was in Vietnam, because sometimes Special Forces 8 detachments would get cut off, or their patrols would be outside the range of the radios, and you couldn't talk to anyone. So they gave us some carrier pigeons to try and train and use, and it didn't work. The Montagnards ate them.
Although it was denied at the time, the Special Operations, or SOG, forces in Vietnam ran a variety of cross-border operations into Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam.
We didn't want anybody to know that we were in Laos or we were in Cambodia at that time. They were highly classified operations at the time.
Conducting covert missions into restricted areas called for some special preparations and precautions.
SOG had a very efficient operation as far as what they were allowed to do. And each section was compartmented, so someone in another section wouldn't know what that section was doing. You know, you might hear rumors, but it was too compartmented in some respects.
Basically, all the teams wore sterile uniforms. In fact, we did on the helicopters, the pilots, myself. We wore uniforms with no American insignia, that sort of thing. I used to fly basically wearing a tiger suit, camouflage. No identification of any kind, no ID tags. The teams were the same way. Depending on the mission and the area, they might be wearing black pajamas like the Viet Cong did, or they might be wearing North Vietnamese uniforms or whatever, or a mixture of anything like that. The recon teams consisted of 2 or maybe 3 Americans, 1 team leader, 1 radio telephone operator, commo man. And you might have anywhere from 4 to 8 indigenous types. Cambodians, Montagnards, Chinese Nungs, or in some cases Vietnamese. You never mix the two. You could put Cambodians and Montagnards together. They could work very well. The Nungs and Vietnamese get along. But you couldn't mix the Montagnards and the Vietnamese, and you couldn't mix the Cambodians and the Vietnamese. So we had basically teams that were consisted of one or the other.
One mission of SOG forces was to observe and interdict traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a North Vietnamese resupply and reinforcement route that traveled through Cambodia and Laos into South Vietnam. Another special war effort was conducted by the Army Special Forces, the Green Berets.
Primary mission for Special Forces is unconventional warfare. And that breaks down into guerrilla warfare, escape and evasion, sabotage, and that sort of thing. Integrated psyops in it also. But your basic mission is to go behind enemy lines and raise and train and support and employ a guerrilla army. Any Special Forces A team, 12-man team, should be capable, is, on paper at least, raising a 1,500-man army. Well, that's what they call in the military structure one hell of a force multiplier.
In order to communicate with the Vietnamese and the Montagnards, the Montagnards are like the American Indian. There were several tribes, and even though they had the same language base, there were different dialects. We communicated primarily through interpreters. We had one or more interpreters on the payroll, and they were natives. The first one we had was Laotian, and I have no idea how many languages he spoke. I mean, he spoke beautiful English, he spoke Vietnamese, he spoke Cambodian, he spoke French, and several Montagnard dialects. The guy he was a young man, in his 20s. He was phenomenal. And so most of our communication was that way. Some of the Americans had some Vietnamese language school experience, so they could communicate a little bit. Some of the Americans spoke French. So a lot of the Vietnamese officers had some French because it'd been a French colony, and they'd been taught, if they'd gone to a Catholic school, they had learned French as a second language. So through a mixture of languages, through interpreters and hand and arm signals, that's how you communicated. When you go out on patrol, we would go out with 100 Montagnards, usually a company size, and we would move down trails through the forest. You may have heard other veterans or people talk about that you should never walk on trails in Vietnam because you'll get ambushed and you'll run into booby traps. You cannot move 100 soldiers through the forest quietly without going on trails. And our job wasn't to sneak around so much as to go out and find the enemy. So if we made a little bit more noise than we should, then that's just the way it was. I will say one thing is when you're dealing with Montagnards, at least in my situation, the whole time that we were there, we only had one patrol ever get ambushed. Montagnards normally don't get ambushed because they're like going out with Apache scouts in the southwest United States. They know the bad guys. They can smell the North Vietnamese before you get to them.
Special Forces also had a humanitarian mission.
We had one of the two medics on the A team on a daily basis. Every morning he would hold a sick call for the soldiers, and then after that they would normally go down into the village and do the same thing down there and take care of any of the villagers that needed medical assistance.
Medical assistance was important to the Special Forces. For the regular forces in Vietnam, it was vital. The combat medic, or doc, was everyone's friend in a jam.
The medics were highly thought of in the field because the infantrymen really knew that when the chips were down, that's the person, that's the individual that's going to be your first line of defense from dying.
Some of these men objected to war, but served in this medical capacity as conscientious objectors.
When I was drafted, I ended up as a medic. So that was kind of by choice because I went in as a conscientious objector. And the only thing that they had open at that time, well, probably even now, is a corpsman.
My attitude was I was always trying to help people. And so the memory, some really ugly memories of things that happened, but as far as the negative part afterwards, I didn't really ever feel that. I always felt like I was there my purpose was to save people, not blow people away.
You think you can save everyone, and you can't. When you're a good medic, the guys, they took care of you. If you weren't, it was, their life was in your hands. So it was kind of rough on those that couldn't handle the job. North Vietnamese, or the local guerrillas in the area, they knew the value of medics and commanding officers, radiomen, and they didn't hold to, like, Geneva Convention and give them any leeway. In fact, they became targets. That's why code names and for that. And we tried to look like a regular infantryman. Most of my bandages were carried in ammo pouches, and that, where I wore ammo pouches just like the rest. It was a matter of concern by some of the men that I didn't carry a weapon, because say I'm working on them and the enemy comes around the corner, how can I defend him? What would I do? I wondered at times what I would do or wish I could do. That fortunately never happened.
Doc had to be ready to respond to every crisis.
All varieties of wounds, from scrapes and minor to legs being blown off, sucking chest wounds, type of wounds, and like I say, booby traps were the worst because it was just scattered.
The medic wasn't alone. The men around him did whatever possible to help save their fellow soldiers.
I had a lot of help. I had the normal guys, it was their buddies too. And they'd be there to say, what can I do? When there was, whether it be a gunshot wound, whether it be a booby trap, whether it be carrying him, transporting him to the helicopter. I had a lot of help. When everything settles down and you have to walk back by all of your friends in your company, they know you know exactly what happened, that you know the condition. And it's like going up to a family member and telling them that they're not making it, or they made it, or whatever. It just became very emotionally stressful that way. But on the other hand, they knew you cared, they knew I cared, and there was a family out there. We looked after each other.
When the wounded could be evacuated, backing up the medic on the ground was the best military medical system ever fielded in the history of armed conflict. Often in the field with the infantry were the battalion surgeons. These doctors could often make the difference between life and death for a GI in the heat of battle. For most soldiers in Vietnam, one day was more important than any other. More important than your birthday, Christmas, and the 4th of July all rolled into one. That was DEROS, date of estimated return from overseas.
I never heard anybody, any of my troops, ever complain about the President of the United States or the Congress or anything else. It was when am I going to go home? And what's the next casualty supply?
The best day of all was when I left.
My best day? When that plane was taking off.
I always remember the day I come back. The reason I also remember the day the first guy walked on the moon for the same reason. We're flying over the Pacific Ocean, and I guess in my case it would have been July the 21st, but the pilot says, hey, the first guy walking on the moon, I'll put it on a loudspeaker. And to be perfectly honest with you, I've said, who gives it? Who cares? I'm going home. I don't want to even hear this.
I go to get on the plane, and the guy looks at my shot card, and he says, you don't have your plague shot. I said, why the hell do I need my plague shot now? I'm going home. He said, well, you got to have your plague shot to get on this plane. And now, mind you, it's about 6:30 in the morning now, and nobody's going to be around the base till 0800. And so I said, well, where can I get a plague shot this time? And he says, well, the sick bay's over there. So oh my God. So I took off, and it was like a quarter mile across this grinders. I ran all over to this place, hoping there'd be a night nurse or something give me a shot. And I walk in there, it's just dead. And the guy's at the desk there, and I ran up and I said, man, I need to get a plague shot really bad. And he says, how come? I said, well, they won't let me on my plane. And he says, they get out of here. He says, well, you know, he says, I'm not a corpsman. And he says, there won't be any corpsmen in here till probably 8:30. He said, but, you know, he said, I've got the stamp for this thing. I'm going to stamp this thing for you, and I can initial that card. He said, then you can just wait right over there. He said, I got to go for coffee. And I was kind of naive at the point. He stamps and he signs the card, and I went over and I sat down. I looked down this long hall, both directions, absolutely nobody around. I looked at the card again, and the light went on because he had left, so he wouldn't know anything about it. So I took off back to the plane, and I was the last one to get on there. It was nice to be airborne, I'll tell you.
To the soldiers in Vietnam, the aircraft that flew people home from Vietnam, the civilian airliners, were known as Freedom Birds. And while you were in the country, you could see these aircraft coming and going from the different places. And they became symbols to us on the ground that we could get through this, that we could go home from this experience and go on with our lives.
Some had regrets, a feeling of unfinished business or guilt that they were leaving their unit that needed them.
It was a very, very hard thing to do, a terribly hard thing to do. Again, I mentioned the closeness and the camaraderie. You felt like you were leaving, walking out on guys that you ought to be staying there with. You knew that you had done your job, and you knew that you had met your obligation, but still in the back of your mind, you had to have some guilt. You weren't human if you didn't feel guilty about leaving your fellow soldier behind.